Alright, let's face it. When you get your first DSLR with a kit lens, you kinda soon realize that your standard kit is just not enough. And that's why I decided to compose this complete beginner's guide on the differences between 85, 50, and 35mm prime lenses. Here's a quick review with tips and reasons to buy any of these options. For the 35mm lens, it's the best walk-around versatile prime lens. Its field of view is similar to the 50mm on FX, it captures more scenery when traveling, it's great for shooting tight spaces indoors, and it's considered a quote-unquote normal lens on a crop body. For the 50mm lens, it's the best prime for a full-frame camera. A 50mm on a full frame equals 75mm on a crop. A standard quote-unquote normal lens on FX cameras. It's versatile on FX but too narrow on a crop. It's good for traditional headshots and portraits. For the 85mm lens, it's the best cheap prime for portrait photos. It's a great choice for APS-C sensor cameras. It's the most versatile focal length for portraits. It's used for outdoors or in large rooms and studios, and it can be your go-to prime lens if you're on a budget. Now, why talk about crop sensor cameras only? The reason is because such questions mainly come from beginner to enthusiast photographers who use APS-C sensor cameras. Professional photographers with years of experience simply won't need this guide. Note that since we'll be talking about focal lengths, it doesn't matter whether you're a Nikon fan or a Canoner or holding a gear of another brand. So without further ado, let's dive right in. The 50mm full frame versus crop. Look, if you currently own an APS-C camera, then it likely has a 1.5 or 1.6 crop factor. In a nutshell, it describes the size difference between a 35mm full frame film and your DSLR sensor. Have a quick look at this image to see the difference between the two. Basically, when shooting with an APS-C crop camera, it captures less than a full-frame sensor camera. And because of the narrower view of angle, you get an impression that a longer focal length had been used as if it was zoomed in on purpose. I want you to remember this when choosing the lenses because their focal lengths are set in accordance with full-frame 35mm sensors. So now let's talk about 50mm lenses on crop sensors versus full-frame. So, 50mm on full-frame sensor DSLRs. The Nifty-Fifty is considered to be a standard lens on full-frame FX cameras, and you can use it in a variety of photography genres. A lot of photographers use this prime because they like that it's one of those that closely resemble the perspective of the human eye. Although a 43mm corresponds more to the human eye, but such lenses are pretty rare. The 50mm on crop sensor. Now, while the 50mm might be versatile for FX cameras, it's not the case with APS-C sensor DSLRs. Technically, this glass will continue to display what you see, but the frame itself will decrease in proportion to the size of the given sensor. In the photo earlier, it seemed zoomed in solely because the crop sensor captures less area than a full-frame sensor. Here's another example of a crop factor. Check this out. As you can see here, when shooting at the same focal length on a full frame versus an APS-C sensor, the frame area is significantly different. The viewing angle also changes on a crop sensor. Therefore, it would be incorrect to say that the 50mm on APS-C is the same as a 75mm, a 50mm times 1.6 crop factor on a FX camera. Instead, it's more accurate to say that the viewing angle of a Nifty-Fifty corresponds to 75mm on a crop. Anyway, if a Nifty-Fifty is pretty universal on a full frame, then it becomes too narrow on a crop in terms of photography uses and genres, so it's likely you won't be satisfied with it as much. 50mm on a crop, a great portrait glass? Well, here's the thing. Some people say that 50mm on a crop sensor camera is a portrait lens. It's not exactly so. As I mentioned earlier, only the viewing angle changes. However, this prime is not the best choice for shooting full-face photos due to sufficient distortion. Remember that a Nifty-Fifty on an APS-C camera might be too wide and you'd have to get in tight and introduce more distortion. And that being said, if you own an APS-C crop sensor DSLR, it's probably best that you do not get a 50mm prime. So what do we get then? Well, let's discuss that below. Using a 35mm lens on a crop sensor body. Here are other common questions that I'd like to address here. What is a 35mm on a crop sensor? And is a 35mm better than a 50mm? We've established that the 50mm is used as a quote-unquote normal prime lens on full-frame DSLRs, which are considered to be a standard and universal one. And here's the good news. There are great lenses on the market that offer this focal length for APS-C sensor cameras, the 30 to 35mm prime. It's with these on crop sensors we get a field of view similar to the 50mm. So 30mm conditionally turns into 45mm or 48mm on Canon. 30mm times 1.5 equals 45mm, and 30mm times 1.6 equals 48mm. 35mm conditionally turns into 53mm or 56mm on Canon. 35mm times 1.5 equals 53mm, and 35mm times 1.6 equals 56mm. You can go ahead and refer to this table of equivalent focal lengths for common lenses and crop factors. Now, if we use a Nifty-Fifty on a crop, we won't have enough space in the room due to its small viewing angle. However, with a 35mm, you won't face such a problem. Shooting full-body portraits indoors? Easy. A prime with such focal length also works great for landscape shots and street photography genres. So what is the best portrait lens for a crop sensor then? Well, it's time to talk about the 85mm. The truth is, the 85mm perhaps is the most versatile focal length for portrait photography. If you want to shoot awesome portraits, whether it's a close-up headshot or capturing more of the person, then I strongly encourage you to consider this prime lens. However, it's important to note that the 85mm is best to use outdoors or in large rooms and studios, because if you were to use it in a small space, then it can be tight should you need to pull back to take more of your subject. And if you're shooting in a small studio or apartment, then you'll just get facial and upper body portraits. So why the 85mm might be the best prime lens for portraits when shooting using an APS-C sensor camera body? Well, the first reason is there's minimal distortion when shooting with 85mm lenses on crop sensors. Therefore, your portraits look as natural as possible. The second reason has to do with the bokeh effect that portrait photographers love so much. The thing is that the background blur is a lot nicer with an 85mm lens compared to a 50 or 35mm prime. Therefore, your portrait photos will look amazing. What is the 85mm on crop sensor equivalent? A lot of people love the 85mm on FX bodies for portraits and may wonder what is the equivalent focal length on an APS-C sensor body. As we saw from the chart above, most crop sensor bodies have a 1.5 or 1.6 crop factor. So anything between 50 to 60mm would be close to get the equivalent of an 85mm lens on a crop sensor body. 85mm times 1.5 crop factor equals 56.67, or 85mm times a 1.6 crop factor equals 53.13mm. But remember, just because we found an equivalent mathematically, it doesn't mean that you'll get the same image. The bokeh effect, the depth of field, and the general perspective will be slightly changed. Prime lens versus zoom, which is better? Now, are prime lenses better than zooms? In this part of the video, I'd like to talk a bit about zoom versus prime lenses so you understand which one is better for your purposes. Now for prime lenses, as you may already know, a prime lens is the one that has a constant focal length. And this is something that scares some photographers off. They believe that because a prime has a constant focal length, then it's less versatile than zoom ones. But here's the truth. Fixed lenses compensate for the lack of zoom with exceptional optical properties and wide aperture. This means that the photos you take with a 35, 50, or 85mm will be of excellent quality in a wide variety of shooting situations and lighting conditions. As for zoom lenses, of course, many zoom lenses have a normal focal length, which is usually located in the center of their focal range. This allows you to shoot more or less the way the human eye sees. However, this flexibility does affect image quality and sharpness. Does that make sense? And here's the typical photography journey of an average person. We realize we have an interest in photography, so we buy an entry-level DSLR with a standard 18 to 55mm kit lens, or standard zoom 18 to 105 or an 18 to 135mm kit lens. After experimenting with it, we soon realize that, well, something is missing. What we're looking for is that top-notch quality level images, and we consider buying new glass, right? After research and communicating with fellow photographers, we learned that perhaps maybe we need to invest in prime lenses with fixed focal lengths. But there are so many options out there. So what do we choose? 35, 50, or 85mm? I hope this article has helped you so far understand the differences, how each prime works on APS-C sensor cameras, and what is the best prime for your portrait photography needs. So, 35, 50, or 85mm for crop sensors. If you have an APS-C sensor camera, I think there's no point in taking a Nifty-Fifty. It will neither be a normal lens nor a portrait lens. If you need glass for amazing portraits, I strongly would consider the 85mm prime. And if you need a quote-unquote normal fixed lens that closely resembles the perspective of a human eye, then consider the 30 to 35mm prime lenses. Don't forget and keep in mind that what kind of portraits you do will matter too. So for example, a 35mm on a crop is the most versatile, as is the 50mm on full frame, but the 85mm would often be better for standard headshots. So for the best prime lens for crop sensors, what are your thoughts? I'd love to hear about it from you. Are you in doubts between prime or zoom lenses? Which is better for your portrait needs, a 35 or an 85mm? Do you now understand the difference between 35 versus 50 versus 85mm prime lenses on APS-C sensor cameras? And as always, if you have any questions and or suggestions, let me know in the comments section below. I'll catch you at the next video.